All right. There's also plenty of seats closer up, you know. I know you all, if it just. Offers for better. I'm sorry I can't make this any larger. Paula, you aren't complaining, are you? What is that? Oh. Okay. Where do I put it? So, last week, if you were here, we talked quite a bit about Europe and the Reformation that happened there. So, beginning in the 1500s, you had a large number of mostly Catholics who were leaving the Catholic Church, people like Martin Luther, who sought to reform the Catholic Church. You had others like John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, who were going into the Catholic ministry, but instead went on their own ways and had their own issues with the Catholic Church. John Calvin himself is one we will be focusing on. He was a young man who was supposed to go into the priesthood, but instead became ordained by himself and founded what was really the Reformed Church. There are various branches of this Calvinist Reformed Church that popped up throughout Europe based on their geography. You had various branches of the Reformed Church that popped up based on their geographical location. Some popped up in Scotland, where you had John Knox and other reformers who were moving for a new Scottish church to be established. You had the Presbyterians there. In England, you had the Puritans. Over in the Netherlands, you had the Dutch Reformed Church being formed. In Germany, you had various factions in the various German states of the German Reformed Church being established. In France, you had the Huguenots. And these Huguenots were unique in that they would actually be the first ones to come to this country, the first Reformed group to settle here. In 1562, they settled in South Carolina. Their settlement was short-lived. The Spanish quickly came and kicked them out. In 1624, they resettled in what was known as New Netherland, which is mostly around modern-day New York. 1685, the French Huguenot Church in Charleston was established, which is what you see up there. And that is the oldest active and what I believe the only Huguenot congregation still in existence in the United States. Most other Huguenot congregations would close and would join in with the Presbyterians and the Congregational Church. This one still remains independent, though it was largely served by Presbyterian ministers up into the 20th century. In 1614, the Dutch really came and settled in what I mentioned was New Netherland, what is now New York and New Jersey. In 1754, they became an independent church. They had been part of the Netherlands, Reformed Church in the Netherlands. They established their own seminary in 1784 and have since gone through a couple of splits. The Christian Reformed Church was formed in 1854, was seen as more strictly Calvinist and evangelical. In 1867, they adopted the name Reformed Church in America, which is their name that they continue under today. One of these Dutch Reformed ministers was John Philip Boom, and he's important for us to know because in 1725 he established essentially an association or a presbytery, what they would call a classis in the Dutch Reformed Church, especially for German-speaking Reformed believers in the U.S., known as the German Reformed Church. It, however, remained subordinate to the Dutch Reformed Church, even though in 1747 they had their first national gathering. There are no pictures of Boom, but this is a picture of his gravesite up in, I believe, New Jersey. Now, in 1603, back in England, the Puritans started to face oppression. If you remember last week, the Puritans had this rather interesting power dynamic. But in 1603, King James I came to power and began oppressing the Puritans. He said, I don't want you following Calvinism anymore. We're going to go back to having a Church of England that's going to be based all around the king. And so the Puritans emigrated first to the Netherlands. However, the Dutch government was allied with the British government, and the King James began a manhunt for some of these Puritan leaders, which the Dutch associated with. Additionally, there were language barriers. All these Puritans spoke English, didn't speak a word of Dutch. And so in 1620, wanting to just establish a new society, they emigrated to America. Now, we all know the story about the Mayflower landing at Plymouth Rock, but one name of one person who was on there was William Brewster. He had been a postmaster and had worked for the Dutch ambassador, or the British ambassador to the Netherlands, and was self-taught in his training of the Bible. He was an elder in the Reformed Church and was the one who was licensed to preach for the Mayflower group. So thus, he was the first Reformed minister and first Puritan minister in the United States. In 1620, the Mayflower Compact was signed, establishing the Plymouth colony. William Bradford was its first governor. Soon other colonies were established in surrounding regions. You had the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And at first you had very little tolerance for any religion outside of Puritanism, which I think is interesting. They had come to America wanting freedom of religion, but soon found themselves imposing their own religious beliefs on everybody who was there. You had some leaders, like Roger Williams, who disagreed. And Williams was a staunch defender of Native American land rights. He felt that the Plymouth colonists should not be encroaching on their territory. In 1635, his beliefs got him exiled from Plymouth, and he instead settled in Rhode Island and later became a founder of the American Baptist Church, but was a staunch advocate for the separation of church and state. Now, the Puritans placed a great value on education. In 1636, they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony College, which was renamed Harvard in 1639. And in 1701, they established the Connecticut Colony Collegiate School, which is now known as Yale. They were also very important in the publishing of some of the earliest hymns. In 1640, you had the Bay Psalm Book, which was the first book of any kind printed in British America. And if you remember last week, we talked about how the Puritans and other Reformed groups did not believe in the singing of hymns. They believed only in the singing of psalms, only rare versions of psalms, and singing them unaccompanied. Later on, though, another Reformed leader, Isaac Watts, would come out with his Psalms of David in Britain, which prompted a move away from this exclusive psalmody and towards other types of hymns, which caused great division in many churches, some of them completely split over this issue. In 1648, the Cambridge Platform was written up, and that really established congregational polity. One of the big changes it made was it allowed for voluntary membership. Until this time, if you were born in a region, Say if I was born in Delhi, I would automatically be a member of this church if I were a Protestant, or if I were a Catholic, I'd be a member of Our Lady of Victory. This changed that. It instead said that anybody who was born, could become a member of any church that they wished to be. So I could become a member of Plymouth if I wanted to, or Pilgrim if I wanted to. It also designated different roles for pastors, elders, and deacons. Now, up until this time, and we spoke a bit about this last week, if you wanted to join a Puritan church, you had to prove that you had been saved, that you had gone through this conversion process. It involved giving a testimony that you had gone through these very specific steps to become reformed. And baptism was only given to children of these full members who had given this testimony of faith. The problem was, there were some people who didn't want to do this, and more people who felt that this was not a fair way. They thought that not everybody should go through the same conversion process. And so in 1657, the Ministerial Assembly allowed the halfway covenant, which allowed partial membership based on a simple affirmation of faith. Instead of saying you went through all this entire very specific process to become a Puritan, you could just say, I believe in these things. And you would become a partial member. You were not allowed to have communion, but your children were allowed to be baptized in the church, which was a very big deal. In 1690, the Cambridge Association was founded. That was the very first of what would become the UCC associations. They met in the library at Harvard and heard and discussed various issues from various churches. And that up there is a picture. Ministers, when they would join the church, they would sign their names in the registration book, which is on display at Harvard. Now, one of the issues they had come up during this time was a little issue in the church in Salem. The Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of the Salem church, in 1692, his slave, Tabitha, he accused her of a witchcraft, and he beat her until she gave a confession. As you can imagine, this soon spread, and everybody began thinking that they were seeing witches everywhere. Many women and men were executed on supposed witchcraft. That included those who simply criticized these trials that were popping up. If you believed that the trials were unfair, people started labeling you a witch. In 1693, the governor of the Bay Colony, William Phipps, dissolved the witchcraft court. And other Puritan ministers were divided over this. There was a father and son duo. Increase was the father's name. He was president of Harvard. And his son, Cotton Mather. Great names, I know. They were both members of the Cambridge Association. The son, Cotton, was a firm supporter of the trials. Increase at first supported them, then came to oppose them, and at the end, it was his pressure that really helped them to end. Interestingly, the UCC, though being a very progressive denomination, has never actually issued a formal apology for what happened at Salem, which I think is kind of interesting. So that was the early history of the Puritans, which forms our Congregationalist side of our polity. Presbyterians were also coming into the area. Now, you had some, like Lord Cardross, who disagreed with changes that had happened in the Church of Scotland. They believed that the Church of Scotland had become too focused, too united with the British Crown. And so they attempted to form a colony in South Carolina in 1683, which, like the Huguenots, was not long-lasting. Later, others would come in and form the Associate Synod of Seceders, and you had the Covenanters, who formed themselves as the Reformed Presbytery of America in 1774. The Covenanters and Seceders were essentially the same. They just differed in their history. I'm not going to go too much into their background, because while they have a role to play in the founding of our church, the differences here are not all that important. But needless to say, they were more conservative than your regular kind of the mainline Presbyterians, who really came in 1683 with Francis McKemmy, who arrived in Maryland in that year. He was Northern Irish, but studied in Scotland, and he established the oldest Presbyterian church in the country, Rehoboth Presbyterian Church in Maryland. He preached along what is now Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. In 1706, the first presbytery was convened in Philadelphia, and Francis McKinney was elected moderator. It included ministers from throughout the Northeast, but soon found that there were issues to be settled. The Scotch-Irish faction was very Presbyterian, while those who came from England and Wales were more congregational in nature. Soon a synod was created, the first synod, the Synod of Philadelphia, which covered all of the Northeast. And in 1647, the British Presbyterians had written the longer and shorter catechisms and believed that if you wanted to be a Presbyterian, you had to adhere to these. The Scotch-Irish thought you didn't need to adhere to the British catechisms. They thought the Westminster Confession was enough. Then the Congregationalists in the Presbyterian Church felt that they didn't want either. So in 1729, the Adopting Act was passed, which allowed ministers to agree to only certain parts of the confessions, with presbyteries deciding whether their views were heretical or not. So thus, a presbytery, to this day, remains the same. Presbyteries determine whether a minister can be a member, not based on any denominational rules, but only on the authority of that presbytery. The ministers vote whether or not to accept a minister after hearing their views read on the floor. Now, churches began to struggle with an increase in Universalist and Unitarian beliefs, and I'll come back to this in a bit. But they saw a need to revive the church. They thought the church was slipping away from its main fundamentals. And thus, the Great Awakening began. And this was not only in the Presbyterian Church. It really took place in the Anglican and Methodist churches as well, with people like Samuel Whitfield, who came over and was an Anglican who really helped found the Methodist Church in the United States. But the Presbyterians and Congregationalists were affected as well. And one of these big names was Theodorus Jacobus Frelinghuysen, who was a German minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. Remember, I shared that the German Reformed members were still part of the Dutch Reformed Church at this time. He arrived in America in 1720 and placed a great emphasis on piety and salvation. A lot of what we know about him in the Bible was interestingly recorded by his slave, Ukasal Groniosa, who took on another name, I can't remember what it was now, but knew how to read and write and recorded a lot of his master's travels. His sons would go on to organize Rutgers in New Brunswick Seminary in New Jersey. But one of his followers was a Church of Ireland pastor named William Tennant, who had come to Pennsylvania in 1718. He was inspired by Frelinghuysen's message and really became involved in this new awakening that was happening. He established a college known as the Log College, because it was made of logs, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and was the first Presbyterian seminary in the United States. Until this time, Presbyterians had attended Harvard and Yale, which, as you know, were Congregationalists. Thus, they had their first actual seminary. Now, in the Congregational Church, in First Congregational Church of Northampton, Massachusetts, you had Jonathan Edwards, who in 1731, like Frelinghuysen, began leading a series of revivals. He was very focused on hellfire and damnation, that if you did not repent, you were doomed to Satan. And this prompted a whole new wave of Christian converts. And Edwards, more than anybody else in the Congregational Church, really inspired the Great Awakening. As a fun fact, his grandson was Aaron Burr, the man who would go on to shoot Alexander Hamilton. And Edwards developed what was called the New England theology. It was split from the more traditional Calvinist theology, and that the Calvinists traditionally believed that mankind became sinful in the Garden of Eden. However, mankind, although created perfect, has become sinful because of this sin caused by Adam. However, they can still repent and turn back to God if God wills it. Edwards disagreed. He felt that mankind was naturally sinful and deserved condemnation. He felt that there should be a greater emphasis on free will and repentance, that if you wanted to repent and turn to God, then you had the power to do so. He also implemented strict rules for who could and could not take communion. And this led to a division in the Congregational Church. You had the old school, or the old lights, as they called themselves, who were more traditional Calvinists, and the new lights, who followed folks like Edwards and other revivalists. One of the Presbyterian ministers inspired by Edwards was William Tennant's son, Gilbert Tennant, who wanted less emphasis on theological education and more on spiritual awareness. He said that the institutional Presbyterians, the Presbyterians of that time, were all Pharisees, and said that they should be focusing less on getting a formal education and instead sitting by themselves and trying to hear what the Spirit is telling them. This led to a break in the Presbyterian Church. Soon, there was fighting throughout the Presbyterian Church, and in 1741, those who followed folks like Tennant and William Blair and Jonathan Edwards formed the Conjunct Presbytery, or the New Side, while the Old Side ministers and churches remained in Philadelphia. The Old Siders would establish the first Presbyterian college in the South, which was Washington and Lee College. And in 1746, the New Light ministers in Elizabeth, New Jersey, formed a college, what they called the College of New Jersey, which moved around a bit before settling in Princeton and is now known as Princeton University, and to this day is still a Presbyterian college and seminary. Now, one of these early Presbyterian ministers was David Brainerd, who had a difficult life. He was born in Connecticut, had gone to school in Yale, but was expelled from Yale and was not allowed to minister in Connecticut. The New Side Presbyterians had less of an emphasis on the importance of theological education, so they ordained him. And he became the first dedicated Reformed missionary to Native Americans. He also suffered from tuberculosis all of his life and died quite young. He was only 29 when he died. In 1758, the schism that had occurred between the New Side and the Old Side ministers came to an end. They reunited, but the controversy did not die down. New presbyteries continued to be formed based on theology rather than geography. Now, one of these New Siders was a man named John Elder, he was an Old Side minister in Paxton, Pennsylvania. The New Side was much more tolerant of Native American rights than the Old Side was. The Old Side felt that it was their duty to go and conquer the land. Now, in 1763, the Native Americans rebelled against the British in what was called the Pontiac War. And this minister, John Elder, raised a volunteer militia known as the Paxton Boys. And in 1763, they led a massacre of 20 of the Susquehannock people. And they subsequently attempted to attack Philadelphia and take over Philadelphia, but they were stopped by Gilbert Tennant and Benjamin Franklin. But at this point, of course, a lot of things were going on in the country, and soon the Revolution broke out. Now, Calvinists, almost universally, not entirely, but large majority of them, saw similarities between their own history in Britain and the revolutionary spirit that was growing in the country, which is why sometimes the revolution was called the Presbyterian Rebellion. Like I said, most but not all Calvinists sided with the Continental Army, and I'm going to talk about a few of those leaders today. John Witherspoon was a Church of Scotland minister who came to America and became president of Princeton University. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was one of only 2 signers who were ministers, and was the only active pastor at the time, and also the only college administrator to sign. I spoke a little bit about him this past Sunday, if you were in church. The other minister who signed the Declaration was Lyman Hall, who in 1753 had left the ministry. He was Congregationalist and became a physician. He was a delegate to the Congregational Congress from Georgia. Now, another Presbyterian minister who did not sign but was very instrumental in supporting the rebellion was James Caldwell. Now, Caldwell, for the most part, had stayed out of the war until, as the story goes, one day his wife Hannah was killed by British soldiers Maybe it was on purpose, maybe it wasn't. A lot of people believe it was a misfire, it was friendly fire that killed her. But if you go to Union County, New Jersey, they actually have on their flag, each county in New Jersey has its own flag. And the flag of Union County, New Jersey actually shows them shooting this woman, which is very bizarre. So if you ever go to Union County, they still show his wife on the flag. As a pastor, he was nicknamed the Fighting Parson and quickly joined the Continental Army and served through much of the war until he was killed by one of his own men who was reportedly bribed to assassinate him because he was such an effective speaker. You had George Duffield, who was a Presbyterian minister and chaplain to the Continental Congress, which was a predecessor to our United States Congress. He was a chaplain at the battles of Princeton and Trenton. Another chaplain was Israel Evans, who was served in numerous battles alongside George Washington, to whom he served as a spiritual advisor. He fought at Fort Ticonderoga, Saratoga, Valley Forge, and the Battle of Yorktown, amongst others. Others played a role in a less notable way, or a less visible way, but still very important. Samuel Kirkland was a Presbyterian minister who served as a missionary to the Iroquois, who were a Native American tribe up in upstate New York. He helped gain support amongst Native Americans for the Patriot cause, which was very important because many Native Americans supported the British because they thought the Americans would just come in and encroach on their land, which of course proved to be true. But Kirkland helped turn some of these tribes against the British and support the Patriots instead, and also founded Hamilton College in New York, which he named after Alexander Hamilton. Another congregational minister was Timothy Dwight, who was a grandson of the great Jonathan Edwards. He was a Continental Army chaplain and would later become president of Yale. And then you had William Lynn, who was a Presbyterian minister, who was a Continental Army chaplain, and then following the establishment of the United States House of Representatives, became the first chaplain to the U.S. House of Representatives. And there have been a number of Presbyterian chaplains in the House since, including the current chaplain, Margaret Kibbens, who's also, I believe, the first woman to be a chaplain in the House. Not only ministers were serving in these important roles, however, there were also many laymen who were taking on important roles in the rebellion. One of the heroes from my home state was Andrew Pickens, who was nicknamed the Fighting Elder. He led patriots in Georgia and the Carolinas and later was in Congress representing South Carolina. And one more to mention was, to recognize our German Reformed heritage, was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who was a German military officer who came to America in 1777 in order to join the revolution. Washington thought very highly of him, and because he had this prior military experience in Germany, Washington named him Inspector General of the Continental Army. Throughout his life, he was a faithful member of the German classes of the Reformed Church, and was a regular attendee in church on Sundays. Now, next week, when we reunite, we're going to talk more about the movement west and establishing in this new country after the victory of the revolution, what Congregationalism, what Presbyterianism would look like. So any questions for me tonight?
I've got a curiosity question.
Yes.
Was it Jonathan Edwards that wrote Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God?
Yes, I believe so.
For some reason, you mentioned that name and way back in the heart of
She asked if Jonathan Edwards had written Sinners in the Hands of a Vengeful God, Angry God. And I said I believe he had. He wrote a number of very, don't want to say vitriolic, but his sermons were very, I don't know, it's the fire and brimstone, that's a good way of putting it, yeah. Very pointed, yes. And so, like I said, that was kind of the big impetus for this split between the old school and the new school. The old school did not believe in that kind of preaching. They believed that the minister's job was to expound upon the Bible and not go into issues of salvation and things like that. Edwards disagreed, and as we'll learn next week, the Congregationalists really were split over this issue, and many of the ones who opposed Edwards and some of the ones that sided with him as well would soon split in and of themselves. We'll talk about that next week.
It's just interesting that the Puritans, when they came, you know, they were behaving just as the folks were behaving that caused them to be where they were.
Mm-hmm.
I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how that happens. It did not remain that way as time went on, as we know. I think it's interesting because now the UCC is considered one of the most accepting and open denominations that there is. But it certainly did not start out that way.
Well, it seems like all of it, just kind of morphed, which is what they needed to do. I mean, the Bible is a living
Mm-hmm.
organism, for lack of a better term, and God is still speaking. He doesn't just say this and it's frozen in time. And I don't think he ever intended it to be frozen in time. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Well, I think it's interesting how much how much emphasis we put on tradition, and we say our denominational traditions. But as you can see, our denominational traditions change. They're all over the place, and we're going to get even more into that next week when we look at, especially at the Presbyterian Church and the various splits that they would go through. Yeah. The Congregationalists, that's what it was. Congregationalists, yeah. The pastor of the Salem Church there.
It just doesn't seem like behavior becoming a pastor.
Well, it's really interesting. I think that it all started with his slave, a black woman who he accused of witchcraft, who had come from, I believe she came from Haiti or Bermuda or one of these Caribbean islands, and so probably really did have some native indigenous beliefs that were not compatible with Christianity. But the extent to which it spread, that it wasn't just her, they began accusing their next door neighbors, people who looked like you and me. It'd be like, I've known Jean for almost 2 years now. It'd be like me coming up and saying, oh, well, Jean's a witch. I think Jean is a witch. Or people knew each other longer than that. Yep. Well, who knows? They really don't know. She might have been practicing voodoo or some other kind of native religion like that. But... What's that?
I said, I'm in that category in a couple of these places. I married a witch. Rebecca Downs, one of the witches, is my
Eighth great grandmother was one of the convicted witches.
Right.
Wow.
It was against property.
Mm-hmm.
So she was in the jail, but then was released. And I'm also a pilgrim.
That's right. You're descended from the Mayflower.
I was on my ancestors from the Mayflower.
Very cool. Which I think is interesting. So you're truly, your congregational side goes way back, but you were part of the Presbyterian side, which I think is interesting. But, it's interesting you mentioned property. It's, as we talked about a little bit last week, sometimes these splits were not based around theological reasons, but around more material reasons. We'll talk about some of that Sunday when we look at Jacob and Esau and their battles between each other. I've heard various different theories, and I don't think you can prove any of them now because they're all, it's been so long. But I think a big part of it there was mass hysteria. people start thinking something and everybody starts thinking it, and it's hard to get people away from that.
Well, we
That-
kind of see that, I mean, even in like mob violence.
Absolutely.
It's not the same, kind of, like you said, kind of scary.
I was watching the movie Do the Right Thing. Have you ever seen that? Spike Lee. It's Do the Right Thing. I was thinking about that actually last week. You know, it's how suddenly they're fault on both sides, but how everybody starts turning against each other at kind of the climax of the movie. About a boy in delivery boy in, I believe, Brooklyn, some part of New York, and it's a black delivery boy working for an Italian pizza company, and soon there's this racial conflict between the two sides. Even though they had all grown up together, suddenly nobody trusts each other anymore, and a riot starts. And
So I have a course of history, families, doing my genealogy for the family. I found out that my family came from Kilmarnock, Scotland. And so Eileen and we went over there to Kilmarnock. There's a history there of the Finleys. We were governors, as we mentioned and the British had a terrible time with us. They put us on ships, shipped us away, put people on ships, put them out in the ocean,
yep.
so they would just perish. And when we were in Kilmarnock, we went to the church where my family went. The books are still there, and James Finley was a Coventer, and in the kirk, that's the name of the church, kirk, in the cemetery there were tombstones. One said William F. Finley, whose head was removed by the British because he believed in the Presbyterian Church and not the British.
Wow.
I have a history so that you when we get involved. Yeah.
Larry, did it say that on the tombstone, that his head was removed?
Yes. Removed. Yeah. Well, I don't know how it said it. I have pictures of it.
Well, as I mentioned last week, when the Puritan Oliver Cromwell came to power and they ousted the king, after he died and the king came back to power, they dug up his body and removed his head and put it on display as well. That was something the British would do. It's gruesome to think about, but it still happens today. I mean, not as commonly, but I think some of the dictators that have been taken out, not saying these were dictators, obviously, but, a couple cases where people's bodies were put on display. It's very gruesome to think about. But again, there's kind of a political reason for that. It's not just religious. It's not religious by any means. It's purely political by that point. Oh, absolutely. That's why part of why the Puritans came. Is the Church of England was tied in with the British Crown. And when did I mention something like that? I guess it was on Sunday. That it was not just a vessel for people to reach God. It was a way to keep people subjugated to the British government. And that continued in the New World, which is why these colonists did not go to Virginia. Well, there were other reasons for that too, but Virginia was an Anglican colony. The people there were part of the Church of England. Plymouth was established to not be that way. And as we saw, there had been previous attempts to establish colonies that had not worked, mainly in South Carolina and Florida, but it wasn't until they got to Plymouth that they really made, a church that was not only Church of England. You'll have to excuse me sitting down and my hesitancy at the beginning. I recently went on a new medication that causes my blood pressure to drop, and so I'm okay, but just, this makes me a little dizzy sometimes. But, yes, John?
It's interesting
Oh,
It's just, I guess, part of religion. People feel strongly that, a lot of people feel strongly that their way is the only way and the right way.
one of the biggest differences between, in terms of history, between the Presbyterians and the UCC is that the UCC has been merging as a result of a whole bunch of mergers. You know, and that's why I find it so important to talk about the Congregationists, but also the German Reformed ministers. And we'll get more into those guys next week as we move west, and you had more German immigrants moving west. The Presbyterians, on the other hand, have been splitting since they were in Scotland. And it seems like I'd argue every 20 years they split and there's a new denomination formed. It's sometimes quicker, you know, sooner than that. And we'll see some of that next week and in the week after. But yeah, back when I mentioned the Covenanters and Seceders, which Larry mentioned too. And I spoke a little bit about them last week. The Covenanters and Seceders, again, they broke away from the Church of Scotland when they were still in Scotland over issues that today would seem so minute, and part of it was political. They didn't like how the Church of Scotland had become essentially structured much like the Church of England was, and had bishops, etc. Even after they'd gotten rid of the bishops, and those differences had kind of been settled, they still refused to reunite because they were so proud of their heritage. And even as these groups would merge later, and we'll see that next week, there would still be holdouts who wanted to remain by themselves, which is why you still have a couple denominations that date all the way back to Scotland, but they're very small and only have a couple congregations and a handful of members, but still call themselves, you know, the true Presbyterian Church.
Looking at changes and evolution in the past, any views from Milwaukee? Is there anything coming down the pipe?
I don't think so. There's, I will say this. My biggest concern I came back with from Milwaukee. Are we still being recorded, John? Are we still being recorded? Yeah, I think that's good.